Hey everybody, welcome to that CMMC show. Today we are joined by Matt from A-LIGN, a trusted and valued partner here at Summit 7 in the C3PAO space, and we're excited to basically kind of make some laps, ask you some questions that we get asked. How in the world are people actually assessing some of this stuff? So Matt, pleasure to meet you. Pleasure you're on the podcast today, and I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me and us, myself on behalf of A-LIGN, Daniel. No, very excited to be here, answer any questions that you guys are seeing. This is also just very informative for me. I like hearing what you guys are hearing from organizations seeking certification as well. Obviously, I have a ton of sort of frequently asked questions that I get on my end. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap, but I'm happy to chat through all of this and help however I can.
Yeah, let's go for it. Let's go ahead and start off with a spicy one out of the gate. And listen, you guys have to get this all the time because we get it all the time.
Yeah.
You know, the CMMC scoping guidance threw in some things called relevant controls for security protection assets, firewalls, spam filters, endpoint detection response, just to name a few of them. So when you guys go out into the field and are doing some formal assessments, how do you deem what a relevant control is? Is there a cheat sheet somewhere that we should be aware of? Like, what's a good methodology to follow?
I think to your point, it's a very good question because we do get it a lot. And to your point, it comes from, you look at the scoping methodology and it literally says on there, relevant controls. Okay, what are relevant controls?
Very open-ended. Like, come on, guys.
That's the natural question from that. So for us, the approach that we would take as a C3PAO, I mean, I would think about it as not all security protection assets and the information that they create are the same, right? So there's no, I would say, one particular answer. But I would say go back to the basics of just understanding how your information system, stores, transmits, processes that information and the sensitive information within it. So then you should think about that because that's obviously a critical part of your overall CMMC compliance. Then when we're thinking about security protection assets specifically, think about what information those assets produce and if and how it should be protected, right? So no different than any other information in your system, but first understand like what information you have, and then you should know based on your overall compliance what to do with it in terms of protection. So there's lots of relevant controls. For instance, like if you look at, let's look at the first, access control, checking that there are policies and procedures in place to manage who has access to the information from the security protection asset, right? Just the same you would look at with any of the other information. So that's why I say I think it's really good to just take a step back, not sort of freak out and think, oh, relevant controls, what does that mean? Go back to the basics, right? Go back to, okay, this would be sensitive information that I'm getting from my security protection assets. How would I protect that normally with the other information, right? So you could look at like incident response, how do you prepare for and respond to security incidents involving the security protection assets, right? Like, I think just like, don't overthink it. I think it can be scary because it's vague and it says relevant. But my biggest piece of advice would be, again, just don't overthink that. Think about what information does this asset create? What do I do with, and how do I protect that information? And you should be set.
That makes sense. Now, here's an extra layer to this, which is always fun. And I don't know why they didn't break this into two categories.
Yes.
So there's security protection assets, but some security protection assets process, store, transmit CUI, like a spam filter, right? Yeah. So when you guys go in and start breaking things apart, do your assessors and yourself kind of break these into two subcategories? Like, show us the security protection assets that don't do anything with CUI, and show us the ones that do, just to make sure that they're meeting like FedRAMP requirements and things like that from a cloud perspective.
Good question. Yeah, we would. I mean, if it's storing CUI, that would be different in our eyes, right? Than just the general SPA category that you would see there on the asset categories. And then we would look at, to your point, whether that's internal or ESPs, how you would protect CUI, and we would look at it as such, definitely.
Gotcha. So it's almost like a subcategory. I know Matt Tickham back in the day kind of pitched, hey, let's have two different types of SPAs, but I don't think the DoD enjoyed that comment. So here we are with just one category that can be very confusing.
Yeah, I think instead of overcomplicating it by splitting it out more, it just left it maybe a little bit more vague. But I would agree, maybe that would have been a good approach.
So I mentioned FedRAMP a second ago, and you guys are huge in the FedRAMP space. like you guys kind of that's what the core of your business was for a very long time. You guys have a huge background in NIST 853, which is the FedRAMP backend. And so you guys are very well versed when it comes to a subset of that being the CMMC controls and NIST 800-171. But I have to imagine there's a huge play for FedRAMP here for anyone listening to us that might have a SaaS application that they're running, like maybe it's an ERP system or something like that, that needs to go through this FedRAMP process. And it's very hard to do. But one question that kind of a loophole that people think exists is this equivalency thing. So where are you seeing, the equivalency stack up against actual authorization of applications from the sense of a CMMC assessment, right? So is it easier to assess equivalent? Is it harder to assess? What's the risk tolerance there that you would recommend for people?
You're right. This is an interesting blend of both of our worlds in some of what we do here on the federal side of cybersecurity for A-LIGN. So to your point, we are a 3PAO. We're like a top 3PAO. We've been doing FedRAMP assessments for years. We have a ton of experience in that space. And then obviously, we're a C3PAO for CMMC assessments and certifications as well. So this is the perfect blend of the worlds. And so I do get a ton of questions around this. Yeah, both from organizations seeking certification and from cloud service providers, and a lot of gray in between, and they're confused on which category they need to go into and what their requirements are. So I would say from the 3PAO side, let's talk about that first. So from the 3PAO side, it's obviously interesting. I'm sure most people are familiar by now, but those that aren't, for a while, it was kind of, very vague as to what was equivalent. FedRAMP Moderate Equivalent. Sure. So the requirement, if you're sending CUI into a cloud service offering, is it needs to be FedRAMP authorized or equivalent. What does equivalent mean? Well, we finally got clarity on that a while back. And basically, the DoD issued a memo that outlined what that means and how you need to prove it. Within that, one of the bigger sort of hurdles is that they did not allow any POAMs, no findings. Yeah.
But they do allow that for actual FedRAMP.
They do allow that for FedRAMP authorizations.
So it's harder to do equivalency.
In a lot of ways it is, which I believe would not have been the intent. I don't think should have been the intent. But yes, I think from a cloud service provider standpoint, a cloud service provider that comes to us as the 3PAO, if they have a sponsor and they're wanting to go and get FedRAMP authorized, that's going to be in a lot of ways a more straightforward approach for them, because they can carry POAMs and still receive their ATO, their authorization to operate at the end of the day. With equivalency, that is not the case. So I tell clients there's pros and cons to each, right? If you're getting equivalency, there's pros and cons to that. The pro is we do not have the FedRAMP PMO. We do not have the agency review. It's just the 3PAO assessing against that moderate baseline for your cloud service offering. But the con, obviously, there is no POAMs. And I think that more than makes up for any pros that may have come from the lack of government involvement. So what are we seeing from a success standpoint on that end? It's difficult. It's been very difficult for organizations, as you can imagine, because there are those items that they would traditionally put into a POAM, and it just, can create a process where it may continue to drag out until they can get a very clean 3PAO report to include in their body of evidence.
Can people lose? And this is kind of a open-ended question, but can people lose equivalency? I would assume like they could probably go through a 3PAO assessment. 4 or 6 months later, maybe they have an infrastructure change of some sort and then lose that because they can't have a POAM. Is it possible to lose your equivalency? Would you just have to constantly get recertified every time you made any kind of significant change just to make sure that, you weren't leaving any doors open-ended?
So technically, yes. If you're going to follow the FedRAMP processes and follow the FedRAMP requirements, because again, if you have a FedRAMP authorized solution, that would be a significant change process. If you, drastically change things within your environment, you would do an SCR, significant change request, and then you would have to have your 3PAO come back in and assess the relevant controls to ensure that obviously it didn't, mitigate any of the actual security requirements that change. So technically, I don't think the memo outlined anything in this level of detail, but I think if we're reading it as, hey, you need to be following the FedRAMP requirements and the FedRAMP moderate baseline, yeah, you would probably need to, have somebody come in, issue a significant change request assessment and assess those relevant controls. I don't know that that is outlined. I doubt anybody would do that at this stage, to be completely frank. But in the annual assessment, there is a requirement for the annual assessment from a 3PAO to come in and continue validation. So that's where you would run into a potential, hey, now you're not in compliance anymore.
That's tricky because I mean, you think about people going through their CMMC assessment, they're using equivalent tools, and this could happen to even anyone that's actually authorized, right? If they lose FedRAMP, what are they going to do, right? I mean, now they have to switch tech stacks, they have to move to different systems because if they can't prove that, that's a CUI asset, or pull all the CUI out of it, right? I mean, that's a gamble no matter what. So
100%. I mean, it's a tough situation for OSCs. I think everybody's sympathetic to them in this regard, because that is a tough situation, especially around equivalency. And kind of to the original question, the onus is actually on the OSC to validate the body of evidence is there to prove FedRAMP equivalency, right? Because C3PAOs aren't FedRAMP 3PAOs. They're not going to go in and assess each time. They're going to validate that the OSC has looked at that body of evidence to prove FedRAMP equivalency. And so it's not a great situation. But to your point, there are some risks involved with, yes, the potential is there that equivalent or technically even authorized solutions, they could lose their status. So that is definitely something that I would at least think about as in terms of mitigation. Hey, if this were to happen, what would our plan be?
Man, you could deal with all the fun questions, don't you, Matt? This is speaking of another one, I call it the F letter, the 4-letter F word in this compliance space, our friend FIPS.
Yes.
So FIPS 140-2 kind of on its way out. FIPS 140-3 kind of on its way in. So Rev 2, because it's been hard coded for CMMC and apparently FAR CUI, at least in the proposed state, FIPS is going to be something to wrestle with for quite some time. So I guess my question to you is, let's say I can't buy an appliance with FIPS 140-2 anymore, and I can only get -3. Is that something I need to put on a POAM? Do I get point deductions? Or is that just something that assessors are seeing as an understood thing and just going forth with approving the -3?
Good question. And the latter, an understood thing. And the way that you described it, we're seeing a ton of that as well. And understandably, having a tough time finding what you need that would be 140-2 anymore as the transition is happening. So absolutely, 140-3 in our eyes supersedes 140-2 requirements. And so that would not be a POAM, no points for that. That would be a compliant situation in our eyes.
Awesome. That's great. Man, you are just knocking it out of the park today, Matt. This is what I'm talking about.
Well, you're teeing them up, man. I mean,
we're going to have to stump you here in just a second. So let's see what else I got here in the queue that I get asked all of the time. Let's see.
I love hearing your FAQs. I mean, it is fun. There's a lot of overlap. Yeah.
All the time, especially, okay. So 3 major industries that we support: construction, like architectural engineering and construction, AEC, regulated research, which is its whole other thing.
Yeah.
And then, oh my gosh, manufacturing, of course. Yeah. And so there's little nuances to all of these that they're like, is G code compliant, right, on the manufacturing side? Or we'll have, printing, drawings, things like that, schematics of buildings, right? Like, what's the data flow for somebody in the construction space that has a supplier that's a 1-person shop that delivers rocks to a job site, right? And so there's all these fun little nuances here, and we get these questions like literally. I probably got about a dozen of them today on calls, which is how we get the Q&A every Friday, right? When Jacob and I are going back and forth, Jacob listens to calls. It gets kind of fun. But these are some more kind of low-hanging fruit, I think, to some extent, but things that people just really don't understand. Like, I talked to somebody today that's a mental health professional. That's their career. That's what their organization does, their small business. He has been tasked with doing CMMC because he has one time built a home server. Wow. So he got the job. 20-person company. He's doing it. He's trying to figure it out. And so some of these questions, like I'll pop this one up next. What type of questions can the OSC's non-technical staff expect from an assessor? So basically, hey, what questions are you going to ask, an HR director potentially, or somebody in a non-technical role that would be good to maybe do some prep work on? By them listening to this, they can actually maybe go talk to those different departments and people and give them a little bit of a heads up saying, these are the types of questions you might be receiving.
Yeah, this is great. And I think this is very important. I tell clients, unfortunately, being CMMC compliant and, getting a certification and going through an audit are not exactly one-to-one. You have to prepare for the assessment itself. And this is part of it, right? What interview questions are they going to ask of who? What evidence are they going to ask for? All that fun stuff. So I'm glad we're diving into this because I get this as well. I think for the non-technical staff, just think about what should be in place. Like, think about more policies, procedures, trainings that should be happening and that you should be aware of. So much less technical. We won't ask any technical questions of non-technical staff. That wouldn't make any sense. But think of things like, hey, like with your particular role, you should be aware of X policy or have taken Y training. Can you tell us, about that training, or what would you do in a certain situation that may be from that policy that's in place, whatever that might be, right? So for instance, maybe a few examples, like, can you describe your organization's security policies and how you and your daily work follow them, right? A very general, very non-technical question, more going back to the actual policy that you should be aware of. And again, with training, hey, have you received cybersecurity training? Can you explain what you learned, maybe how you apply it? It's pretty easy to tell in these sort of questions. You don't have to ask a lot as to whether they are aware of this at all or not. So, I mean, and some other things, right? Like, can you explain, like, if you were to receive what you think is a phishing email, what would you do? Right? Stuff like that. Not technical at all, but really brought down from the policy, procedure, and trainings that, as part of your overall CMMC compliance, these people should be aware of.
So here's a follow-up to that. So let's say I've hired you, Matt. Come assess us, right? Now, we just went through our assessments a few weeks ago, which we thankfully passed, which is great to say. But can an assessor kind of look down a list of employees and say, I want to interview these 3 people? Or is this something that we would serve up to you, right? These are the 5, 10 people that we've prepped to conduct interviews with you. Do I get any say in that process, or does it kind of defeat the point?
A little bit of both. It's not that you get no say, but it's not that the OSC can dictate to us, hey, these are the 3 people who can answer interview questions. That would defeat the point a little bit. It's like, okay, well, you train those 3 people up and maybe you
I know what you did there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a telltale sign right there. A lot of that gets outlined in phase 1. So I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit, but the CMMC assessment process, the CAP, all the C3PAOs need to follow this general process. There's 4 main phases. In the first phase, it's called plan and prepare assessment. So there's several aspects to us planning and preparing the assessment. One of them is exactly this. Let's talk about who are going to be the POCs involved from each end, from the C3PAO. Here's our assessment members, their roles, and then from the OSC as well. Who's going to be involved as the main point of contact? That's going to be kind of the daily, person running point on this. Who's, your executive sponsor, who oversees, and that's how you really need to think about it, is like, who oversees and is responsible for what practices, what domains, right? Anybody that's involved in the actual scope from that perspective is open to being interviewed in this example.
Which could be a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people we talk to don't have like a RACI matrix, right? Who's actually responsible and accountable and consulted and informed, and they don't have like names next to this. And when you start diving into it, you realize it's a big portion of the company that's contributing to the pass or failure of your CMMC assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. And this can be difficult in that planning process. And this is why some phase 1s or just planning with OSCs sometimes can take a little bit longer, or maybe they don't pass phase 1 because they weren't fully ready at the gate. Like, you hit the nail on the head there. Like, maybe they don't have a good sense for who needs to be involved. And when we're asking some of these questions around, hey, who would be in charge of this, they have to kind of scramble internally. And we're like, this is not a great sign that you're ready to be assessed.
Yeah, it's not a good look, guys. So you mentioned something a second ago called phase 1 as part of the CMMC assessment process that you guys go through. And I get this question a lot because people are like, do I have to go through the whole assessment only to realize I failed after step 1 or phase 1? So when you guys are going through assessments, at what point is an organization kind of aware that, hey, guys, you're not gonna pass, right? Do you have to wait to the end? can you tell them and disclose early and say, hey, we're going to wrap up right now and, come back to us when you're ready kind of thing? What does that look like?
Good question. I have to laugh because that image in my mind does sound very funny. Just the idea of like, all right, we're done. All of our other meetings are canceled. We'll see you later.
See you guys. Just walk out.
Try again next time. No, so there are three main sort of, I think of them as like gates in the process to help ensure that we are moving along in a manner that will provide a successful outcome in the end, I will say, right? Those three main gates that I think of them are phase one. We've talked about this. Plan and prepare assessment. Part of that is we have to validate that you're ready to be assessed. Now, that does not mean it's not a determination of if we think you will pass or not, right?
Okay.
I want to be clear about that. That's not us saying like, oh, you're looking pretty good, let's go forward with this, or like, it's probably not going to work out for you, sport. That's not what it is. It is, do they have sufficient documentation and evidence available for us to actually conduct an assessment? That's what that is. So that's the first sort of gate in the process, because I think obviously if you're not meeting those metrics, you probably weren't going to pass an assessment, right? I think that's fair to say. So if you do not make it past phase one, that first sort of gate, as I would think of them, that is what happens, as you outlined it, Daniel. Hey, we had you on our schedule to start phase two on blah, blah, blah date. You do not appear ready for us. We're going to push that out. You need to go back and fix whatever items we thought your SSP's half empty or whatever it is.
You obviously used the template and forgot to fill it out, right? It's like,
you have to put stuff in the template, right? Yeah.
Right.
So they're like, I found an SSP. I'm good.
I found one.
So that is the case. That would be, hey, you did not make it past phase one. We're going to reschedule when you're ready. Come back to us, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Assuming you pass through phase one, you're ready to be assessed. The second main sort of gate that's built into the process is phase two is what you would think of as the actual assessment, being audited. That's when we examine, interview, test methodology comes in for validating, compliance to all the assessment objectives. There is, well, first of all, there are daily meetings that we're having. So you're not caught at the end of an assessment process surprised as to what we may have found throughout the assessment process. We are meeting with you regularly on a daily basis. So we will make you aware of, hey, we had this finding today. Now, what that means in terms of failing or not, we get into the weeds a little bit. There is the option to carry a POAM. So having a finding does not automatically mean you would fail the overall assessment. It depends on which particular practice you have failed or marked as not met. So they have different point values, as anybody submitting to SPRS is aware of. You have 1, 3, and 5 point values. Any 3 or 5 pointers, that would cause you to fail the assessment because those cannot go into a plan of action and milestone. But eligible 1 pointers can go into a POAM. I'll talk about that later. But what happens in phase two is if you have a 3 or 5 pointer, you get 10 business days by the end of that assessment process to resubmit evidence showing that you are actually compliant to that control that we previously deemed as not met.
See, that's awesome. And I don't think a lot of people know that there's kind of this window of remediation, right? Everyone thinks that like, oh my gosh, Matt's going to come in and say, you missed this one thing and it's going to be over. And then I've got to go do the whole thing all over again. So it's nice to know that there's a window there for remediation and then resubmission of evidence that, yes, I forgot to turn FIPS mode on the firewall. I'm going to go turn that on real quick. And then I'm going to go show evidence. Yep, it's on. It's eligible. Here's the cert from NIST, so forth and so on. That's really good to know, actually.
I completely agree. Not a lot of people know about this, and it is very refreshing when I talk about it to clients and they're like, I didn't know about that. And then I can point them to the relevant language and they go read it for themselves. Not that they wouldn't trust me, but trust but verify. So that's the second sort of gate in the process that I think is pretty critical that not a lot of people are aware of. The third gate, if you will, is what I talked about before, that plan of action and milestone phase. So I talked about phase one, plan and prepare assessment. We have to validate you're ready for the assessment. Phase two is the actual assessment. Phase three is more of the reporting on the back end, uploading your assessment results into the DoD system, EMAS. If you pass the assessment and had everything marked as met, level 2 certification coming your way. If you did not, and you have the eligible 1-pointers, that's when you go into the 4th phase. You're issued a conditional certification, and it's conditional on what? Well, you go into a 180-day window, the 4th phase, to close out those 1-pointers. The eligibility, though, the one thing I do want to call out, you have to meet at least 80% of the overall 110. That equals 88 practices. And they have to be the eligible 1-pointers, but then you can carry those into a 180-day window of plan of action and milestones.
So if I fail all my 1-pointers, I don't get a conditional, right? It's only a certain amount of those. Okay.
Exactly.
And the 1-pointers, and I joke about this all the time. If you're failing 1-pointers and not 3 and 5s, chances are something's wrong, because 1-pointers are kind of the low-hanging fruit in the DoD risk matrix, if you will.
It's a good point. Yeah, exactly. But it is nice to know that there are those. So I guess back to the initial question: if you fail the assessment, will you know right away? You'll be aware of where you're at and how you're doing throughout the entire process, and then there are those processes in place to make it so that you aren't an automatic fail.
Perfect, man. This is great. Here's one, and I'm kind of bouncing around here a little bit because I think we're on a good train here from an assessment perspective. International. So I get the privilege of talking to a lot of international organizations, and they come in 2 different flavors. Primarily commercial work with a small subset of DoD, right? So they mass produce something. Let's call them a manufacturer that's building a gizmo, right? Mm-hmm. We've got factories and all sorts of locations that are doing defense-related work that has CUI. Or the other piece of it, which is FOCI mitigated companies. So a parent let's call them a European company, like from France, that have a US location, right? And there's a proxy board set up between them so that, the left can't necessarily know what the right's doing, right? And FOCI is meant and put in place for classified work they might be doing. But for the sake of this conversation, are you aware of any international CMMC certifications that have taken place? Because I haven't heard of a single one.
I am not aware of any certifications that have taken place. Part of that is that OSCs can't announce their certificates quite yet because
that's right.
Certificate isn't. We thought it was approved, and now it's not approved again. I'm sure it'll be approved very soon.
Well, they showed it on the Cyber AB, and it looks like a PowerPoint slide. I'm like, really? Like this? We waited all this for this little slide, and I could have made him PowerPoint in about 10 seconds. Anyways, that's a whole nother thing.
I'm gonna say no comment on that.
Okay.
But that I agree. So long story short, not aware of any that have gone through certification, but certainly there are organizations that we're working with, at whether it's in the sales process or they're under contract but they haven't started yet, that are international organizations. So I'm sure most people listening are aware, but I still get the question of, I'll have like a Canadian company or a European company talk to me and just be like, hey, yeah, I thought about CMMC, but then I was like, yeah, it doesn't apply to us because we're not a US company. And I thought that is not the case. Sorry about that. Yeah, it definitely, not automatically, but can apply. Again, it's more data centric than location centric. So you can be subject to this requirement, even if you're not headquartered here within the United States.
True.
First and foremost.
It's coming for you. All DoD contracts will be applicable to this. And the CMMC FAQ on the DoD CIO's website has some very interesting international verbiage in it for any of those that are curious. So
yeah. So that's on that end. Like I don't know of any that have gone through it quite yet, but yeah, they definitely will be and plan to.
So a lot of these large enterprises that we talk to on the multinational side, usually it's a carve out of people that are doing CMMC and CUI related work, which brings us to the question around virtual desktop. So the DoD finally, through rulemaking, said the physical device that's accessing a virtual desktop is out of scope if everything on the virtual desktop is configured correctly, right? It's basically just a screen and it's emulating keyboard and mouse behavior, and that's all you can do. But here's kind of an interesting one, because it does say that, the physical devices are out of scope if VDI is configured correctly. In your guys' eyes, would that also mean personal devices accessing this enclave, right? A non-corporate asset? Do you see anyone using personal devices for access to VDI and like that's okay because it's technically out of scope? What does that look like? What's been your experience And what are people actually doing? Are they forcing corporate devices for access to VDI, or are they allowing kind of an open-ended approach?
So what we have seen thus far is more organizations only allowing corporate devices for
Okay.
VDI. So to be frank, we haven't seen many, if any, examples of VDI being used on personal devices. I think to your point, there's no specific language you can point to on this very specific use case of the personal devices, but we would take that approach, right? To your point, it's all about configurations. So long as, which I'm glad you mentioned up top, so long as it's configured so that you can't, drag and drop files, print, copy paste, all these sorts of things, and it genuinely is just a screen. Yeah, we would take the same approach. If it's a screen, it's a screen, right?
Yep. And that's kind of the interesting part, because a lot of people use VDI as what we call an enclave, right? It's a small subset of users accessing it. And we're seeing more and more people want to open up their enclave with non-corporate assets to their supply chain, which is kind of interesting, right? Billy Bob's machine shop needs access to view the spec. Well, he doesn't have the money to apply all the technical controls. So we're going to let him use our environment and inherit a lot of these things, right? And so but that's really good to know kind of your perspective on where that stands, even though it's not very commonly used. It's interesting to know, like, is it a possibility to end up doing it, right? And the rule seems pretty clear on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in complete agreement there.
So I mentioned before kind of that enclave with virtual desktops, or what we call the all-in approach, which is like the whole company moving towards CMMC, right? So if it's a 50-person machine shop, all 50 people versus 10 people in an enclave. But like I mentioned before, we're dealing with a lot of different industries: manufacturing, research, construction, developers, things like that. What is the current trend that you're seeing? Are you assessing more enclaves right now, or are you assessing more kind of full top-down corporate, everything's in scope?
This is tough because I don't know that we have enough to say, hey, enough data points, that is, to say, hey, for this industry, we're seeing more of this approach. We're starting to see general trends. And for context, especially for those that aren't aware, so CMMC assessments from C3PAOs really just began in earnest at the top of the year here in January, right? So we're now just 2 months in. So I would say as the ensuing months happen, hopefully we gather more data points, because I personally would be interested in this as well. I think this is an interesting question to look at, especially like industry breakdown, what you're seeing, because obviously you can see certain trends within certain industry. Manufacturing, there may be some trends based on, the way that they store, transmit, and process federal data, but obviously there is nuance to each, right? Some are dealing with more physical CUI and physical devices. Some are still not at all, even though they're in manufacturing. Some are more software focused. So I would say at this point, it just depends too much. And I know that that's not the best answer, and maybe not the most useful answer, but we're just seeing a blend of it currently.
Kind of a 50-50 industry agnostic. We're seeing a lot of enclaves, a lot of all-in.
Yeah. Generally speaking, I would say, if anything, more enclave than all in. I would say it's leaning that way. But yeah, it's not something to where I could say, like, 90% of everybody we're seeing so far is an enclave approach. Not something to that extreme, but yeah, I would say roughly, for rough order of magnitude, roughly 50-50 right now.
Very interesting. People always ask me that question, like, what's everybody else doing? It's the classic, like, am I going to do the right thing? Is it the most cost effective? Is that what other people are doing? Right? All that kind of fun stuff.
And that's where your answer gets into, I'm sure, a lot of follow-up questions, right? Well, that depends.
Oh,
Like, how are you structured? And so that's what leads to not having a good general answer on this, is like, it truly does depend. Not to give the typical consultant answer, but it really does. You want to know more about what that individual business operation is
it
like.
comes back to data flow. Like you said, process, store, and transmit. Where's the data moving? You can move your data around way different than another manufacturer, right? You might have some same type of assets, but you might use a completely different tech stack. Maybe you don't use an MSP. Maybe you do. Maybe they have access. Maybe they don't, right? So all those fun questions.
Yep, exactly. Well, and those are crucial.
On that note, this is kind of the final question that I have, because this one's very, very common. People come to us and say, Daniel, I need to be compliant tomorrow. And I say, okay, best of luck with that. You're not going to find any quality implementer at this point that can do that for you. But one thing they don't think about is, oh my gosh, like if Summit 7, if it takes 2 months to get compliant with Summit 7 instead of 2 days, and then I also have to go through the assessment, they don't think about the time it takes to prep for the assessment.
Yeah.
So if I come to you and I say Summit 7 implementation somewhere between 2 to 4 months, right? We end the implementation, everything's configured from a technical perspective, and then they're like, okay, well, I can go get certified now, right? And this happens so much, Matt. How long would you say after you have an environment that's built and technically compliant, would it take for an organization to prep? Let's use a 50-person company as a good metric here.
Okay.
To actually prep and get ready to go through an assessment. Would you add 2 months to that? Would you add 3 months to that number? How long do you think that would take them to kind of turn the ship culturally to get everything in place?
A couple of things that it might depend on, right? How much of this are they doing in tandem with their actual like control implementation compliance, right? Like in terms of the point that you just made, like, hey, making this an organizational, especially if you're like an all-in approach, making this an organizational sort of thing where we make sure that everybody's aware of these policies and procedures that we're currently putting together. If they're doing that in tandem, I think maybe not as long, but I think there's several pieces to this, right? There's what you just mentioned, but then there's also kind of circling back to something that we said before, like just being compliant and being able to prove it in an assessment are two different things, right?
Yes.
Which I think kind of leads to this question. There's what are we seeing right now? And then what would I probably recommend you buffer in? What we're seeing right now is a mix, to your point, of one day, oh, I'm compliant, let's step into phase 1 of the assessment next. All the way up to, we're take like a 3 to 6 month approach, where they're saying, hey, I'm compliant. Great. Now let's go through again, making sure that everybody's aware of the policies and procedures, the trainings that they need to make sure that they're aware of. But then even further than that, maybe I'm going to do a mock audit. Maybe I'm going to do one internally, or maybe I'm going to go out and get like a C3PAO, like we offer mock audits as well. Basically it's us coming in, going against 171 and all of the 320 assessment objectives that we look at for the full CMMC level 2 assessment for certification. And it is what it is, or it is what the name says, a mock audit. We're going to mock and go through that. Basically it's like taking the pre-SAT before the SAT. Especially because this is the first time most organizations are getting assessed against 171 from an external party. And it's the first time anybody's getting CMMC certified. We're seeing a lot of organizations have interest in that. That was actually a reactive thing where a client said, hey, I really want to make sure this first time through my full assessment goes well. Can we do like a dry run? So we started offering that. And whether you do that with us, you do that internally, or you do a lighter version of it where it's not a full mock audit. But again, you're just going through and you're making sure the right people are aware of the right types of things that they need to be aware of, and the right types of questions that they may get asked. I think that's the biggest thing that clients come away from the mock audit having value from, is they say it was really helpful to get a sense of kind of what you asked about earlier. What interview questions do they ask of who? What evidence and artifacts do they ask for each of these practices and each of the assessment objectives? And that way you can really go in confident the next time, again, not having the answers to the test by any means, but knowing what you need to produce and who needs to produce it to make it a more smooth line process. So I would say, particularly if you take that mock audit approach, whether that's internal, external, or even if it's not like an assessment objective by assessment objective breakdown, I would say buffering in like 2 to 4 months would probably be a smart, wise idea.
That makes sense. So get implemented, try and do as much work in parallel as possible, and then maybe an additional plus or minus 2 to 4 months just to make sure everything's rounded out, right? It's like, okay, we've done a mock assessment, a mock audit, a dry run. Okay, we feel more confident in it, because you're right. Because this has never been a certification requirement before, a lot of people have never done due diligence in doing like a full test run, right, of this. And so I highly recommend doing some kind of mock assessment as a precursor to a formal assessment, because at the end of the day, you don't want to waste your money, right? You want to make sure you go get certified, and it only has to happen one time. Right, every 3 years, but one time all the less.
Yeah, and the timing thing too. Like if you go into that, this is kind of an obvious risk, but if you go into that and then you end up failing the assessment, not only do you have to start over, then you're going, okay, now what is the C3PAO backlog again? When can I get back in the C3PAO schedule to start a new one? So it is a risk mitigation thing. I understand that maybe not every organization has budgeted in for something like a mock audit, but if it's something that you can swing, would highly recommend, because to something we touched on earlier, the phase one we've seen be very hit or miss with clients so far. And I think if they had gone through maybe a mock audit first, things would have gone swimmingly and they would have already been certified. Whereas instead, they didn't pass through phase one and we've had to push off field work of phase two.
So let's talk about that for just a second. I'm going to throw up your LinkedIn, Matt, for anyone wanting to connect with Matt. Fantastic guy, knows his stuff, as you can tell through this podcast that we're doing today. Tell me a little bit more about A-LIGN and the capabilities that you guys have. What are you guys seeing? How do people reach out to you to get a contract underway for either a mock or a gap assessment or a formal certification? Go into that here for just a minute.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Yeah. So A-LIGN, touched on it a little bit. We're a cybersecurity assessment and compliance firm. So primarily what we do is third-party audits for cybersecurity frameworks. So again, we talked about historically that's been FedRAMP in the federal NIST-based side. We also, we're the global leader in like SOC 2 reports issued, ISO 27001, HIPAA, high trust, PCI, you name it, we do it, as far as like a third-party attestation, certification, assessment, depending on the framework, they call them different things. So as it pertains to a C3PAO, to be able to issue level 2 certifications for CMMC, basically what we're looking at right now is, if you're interested in learning more, you can reach out to me directly. That's my LinkedIn, or email me, or info@align.com. Basically, we just want to understand your scope. I have some clients coming to me and saying, hey, how much is the CMMC assessment going to cost? And I ask a few very basic questions around their scope, and they say, I don't really know my scope yet. Great. I don't have a number for you. I need to understand.
You got to tell me to get something out.
Yeah. I can give you a range of what we're seeing, but I would say have an understanding as to what your scope is. But either way, reach out. We'll ask you some questions. We'll have an introductory call. We just want to better understand like where you at in the process right now. Like you said, are you working with an MSP, RPO? Have you been self-attesting to 171? Do you have a SPURS score? Some of these things that give us a sense as to like where you're at in the process right now, and then obviously your scope. And then, yeah, we can get you a proposal and map out what that would look like. In terms of our backlog right now, my understanding is, I think we have one of the more favorable backlogs because we have one of the larger teams in terms of CCA and CCPs. That's the staff that needs to perform these actual assessments. So right now, as of today, it could fluctuate a little bit, but
at the time of this recording, which is the first week of March.
Exactly. As of the first week of March, it's about 10, maybe 12 weeks out from get under contract to starting phase 2, the assessment. That's when I've got a whole team dedicated to it. We can start phase 1 between that point, and we would prefer to earlier, right? That's just takes a CCA reviewing your SSP and validity and availability of evidence. So that can be a quicker process. We start sooner, but yeah, our backlog, it's about 10 to 12 weeks from when we get under contract until we start that phase 2 assessment. So if timing is going to be a critical factor for you guys, you want to get certified, you want to be an early adopter, you want to get ahead of this, I think we've got a lot of advantages in that space. So we would be happy to chat.
That's incredible, because I'm hearing backlogs all the way to like October, November of this year. You guys could start in 2.5, 3 months, which is incredible. So for those interested, feel free to reach out to Matt on LinkedIn or connect here at A-LIGN and fill out a contact form. Matt, thanks so much for joining today. I'm excited to have you back on once I get a slew of more questions, which I'm sure I will get within the next few days. And yeah, thanks for jumping on today.
You'll have a dozen more FAQs by tomorrow, Daniel. But
I will. No joke.
I appreciate you. Congrats on the show. I'm excited and grateful to be on the first episode here. So very excited to watch and listen to the rest of them. But thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good one, guys.